we go. This is the Earth Institute Sustain What live webcast today, focusing on the Great Shakeout. We live on a fast forward planet right now, wrapped in a pandemic still, overheating, with ample evidence all around us that matters hugely for community safety, and we're not where we need to be in terms of public awareness of some of the risks that surround us and how to reduce them. This is a very great opportunity, quick one, with Deanne Criswell, who is the administrator of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And we could talk someday about whether there's a way to update the name of the agency, so someday we can have a Federal Risk Reduction Agency, meaning if we're only managing emergencies, then that's a problem, right? But we'll get to that in another session. Today, we're going to talk about public awareness. We also have Jeff Schlegelmilch from the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University, and Sam Montano at Maine Maritime Academy, author and disasterologist. But we're going to just dive right in with Deanne Criswell, Administrator Criswell, because she has a limited time opportunity here. And what I thought was, let's get quickly to the idea of the shakeout, which has been around for a couple of decades. It's aimed at, obviously, earthquake country, in which I've lived briefly in the 80s in California and have written about far too much. And my notion is that maybe there's a way to expand this idea of a day in which communities focus on preparedness, physical preparedness. What do you do as a person? To a broader look around the house, around the community, for hotspots of vulnerability and what we might do to reduce them. So over to you, Deanne. You're doing a shakeout, I think, today, but just tell us a little bit about how this feels to you. You know, how valuable is this day, and where do we go from here?
Well, Andy, thanks first for having me on to talk about this. It is a good day, right? It's an opportunity for Americans across the country to come together and practice what it is they're supposed to do if they're confronted with an earthquake. And, practice the drop, cover, and hold on. It's not something that everybody around the United States experiences, but there are a lot of areas that have risk. And so what I like to tell people is you need to look and see what your risks are. And do you live in an area that is potentially at risk for a hurricane or for an earthquake? I mean, we were just actually having a conversation earlier today when the earthquake happened in Washington, D.C. in 2011. I mean, not many people were familiar with it. So I encourage all of you listening, look and see what your risks are and know what to do if you find yourself in the middle of an earthquake.
And it's a pretty straightforward recipe if you really are at that moment. Drop, cover, hold on. I was in a classroom in Istanbul, Turkey in 2009, watching the kids do the same thing. But what I was there to write about was, what can this giant city do to get ahead of the game? It's inevitable. The last big earthquake near Istanbul was 1999, and there's definitely another one coming. And that issue is what really, I imagine, Administrator Criswell, you have an amazing resume going back to firefighting. You've been on front lines in so many ways, and you're probably haunted, I assume, by the avoidability of some of the things that we talk about. So what can be done, maybe more widely, to get us to look at our not just our personal response, but a community response? I have this slide up because I was thinking, after Ida, and I know you were here in New York City after that horrific tragedy with people drowning in basements. Can we have a wider day? Is there utility in that? And we'll get to Jeff and Sam. I want to stick with you for this first couple of minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. So while this might be just one day, September is National Preparedness Month, where we do a campaign all month long to try to educate people across the country to learn what their risks are and make a plan for those risks. I mean, that's what's important, right? I remember growing up, and you probably remember growing up and practicing fire drills in your home and what to do when your smoke alarm goes off. And that just became common practice when we would change the batteries in our smoke alarms. We need to do the same thing for the risks that we're facing, and people across the country need to practice this and put a plan in place every day. There's a lot of great information out there on ready.gov or listo.gov where they can find out what needs to go in their plan, how are they going to receive information? How are they going to communicate with family members that maybe live outside of the area to let them know that they're safe or maybe that they need help? All of these things can be done very simply, so you are ready to act if something happens in your neighborhood.
That seems to be the key. And it's simple things like here after Ida, there was some great reporting showing that the city was cutting the budgets for maintaining the drains, for just cleaning out drains and the like.
Mhm.
And that's where community pressure can be part of that too. Where I remember writing about Zika, where
Yeah.
in parts of Southeast Asia, they're using WhatsApp and Twitter as ways for the community to post pictures saying, "Hey, there's standing water in this alley. What do we do about it?" So is that something that's key here too? Community really can make a difference. It's not just why isn't someone doing something?
Yeah, absolutely. While I was just talking about individual preparedness, but if you know of the threats and the risks that are in your community, it's, really important that you're having conversations with your neighbors, with everybody around you in that community to understand how you could perhaps help each other, but then work with your elected officials. They understand the threats that you face or the things that you think need to be fixed in order to help protect you. Having those conversations. I remember when I was in New York City, the one thing that we talked about is that, community members have to, one, have a way to connect with each other in their community. They have to have a way to connect with government so they can have these conversations. And they have to have a way to connect with the broader social services that are going to provide the assistance after some type of a threat might happen.
What you said, I guess, and we'll get to this again with Sam Montano and Jeff in a second in a deeper way. Again, I'm thinking back to Istanbul. There was a small Swiss agency that had worked to develop community centers, 40 of them, for earthquake response. And all it was shovels and picks and lights and stuff. But the guy who was organizing it said the key was the conversations, that once they developed these clusters of volunteers in these parts of the city, which were going to be cut off someday and not be able to rely on the fire department or whatever, that it's the conversations that ensued then, you know, not just maintaining the batteries in the flashlights, that really is the thing that matters. And the last thing is having a more general sense of preparedness, building on that earthquake concept feels like it gets people to be have an adaptive, agile approach to disaster risk reduction, where the earthquake teams in Istanbul, one of them responded to a bombing in a building. They were designed as an earthquake team, but a
I
building
think
so it's this general sense of, wow, being there and ready feels like it's a really great opportunity.
Well, Andy, I think the example you gave in Istanbul is a great example because it's really about the consequences that we're going to face from whatever the event is. And those consequences tend to be similar, whether that's an earthquake, whether that is an explosion, whether that's a tornado. We see the same type of consequences that communities are going to have to respond to. And I love the fact that they had these earthquake centers and they had all the tools and the resources and they're getting out in the community and educating. And I don't even think it's as much as, you need to educate everybody to how to, access those. What I find really amazing in the immediate hours and days after disaster is how the community will come together and the word will get out that, hey, we can go to this center and get equipment to come help with the search and rescue efforts. That kind of community bond, that kind of coordination that just happens spontaneously within communities is amazing. I mean, we saw that after 9/11 with the evacuation off of Manhattan with all of the local boats. Communities are fantastic, and we have to find a way as a government to better tap into that resource and utilize it to help us as we're in those first early days of responding to something.
And maybe one last thing that brings to mind. I had Harold Brooks on here recently, who's at NOAA. He's at the
Mhm.
National Severe Storms Lab. He's done a huge amount of work on flash flooding and tornadoes. That's what I know him best for. And he said, I could almost play the clip if we have time, that one of the other problems is we always, when a disaster is regional or local, hyper local, the communities that face the same hazard feel, oh, that was their disaster, as opposed to looking around and saying, wow, it's our problem too. He's in Norman, Oklahoma, and this haunts me too. I wrote about the Moore, Oklahoma tornadoes.
I was
Um,
there. that tornado.
Were you really? Oh my
Yeah, I
God.
was there right afterwards.
Well, what happened was Moore finally put in tornado shelter, sort of building codes changed in Moore, but not in Norman, Oklahoma. So Norman, Oklahoma, which is 90 miles from Moore, which is the home of the National Severe Storms Laboratory, didn't change their building code yet. And it's like, this is the other thing. I'm sure Sam and Jeff will get at this. Can we propagate lessons without waiting for everyone to have to go through the same learning? If you were there,
Well,
that's really remarkable. Just tell us a
and
little bit
it's
about that if you have time.
so important what you talked about with building codes, and we're seeing that after even Hurricane Ida in areas where they built to stronger building codes, buildings were less damaged or not damaged at all, and the recovery happened so much faster. And in Moore, Oklahoma, it was devastation across the area, right, of where those tornadoes went through and the schools that were impacted by that. But what I actually remember most about Moore, Oklahoma was the increase in the predictability of where the tornadoes may potentially go, and the work that the National Weather Service has been able to do to kind of give more warning than they have in the past. And I talked to several survivors after Moore, Oklahoma, that said they listened to that and they moved into a safe shelter. When they came back, their home was destroyed. And so that kind of warning, as it continues to improve, is critical as we're going to continue to see these severe weather events across the country.
Wow. And the last thing maybe we'll get into is, and this I've done a number of these shows and written about, is vulnerability can be different, right? Even on the same block to some of the things we
Absolutely.
face, that inequity and poverty, and who is homeless, who is working in the heat, who is sitting in air conditioning. Those are conditions and questions that, to me, also get revealed best through some check-in. If communities can do a check-in, like which building has the elderly person on the upstairs floor without air conditioning? The Chicago heat wave, as you all know, was this classic case where Eric Kleinenberg showed that the communities that had cohesion had lower mortality because they knew where the vulnerable people were. And that feels like, I think we all tend to think of go kits, which are important,
Yeah.
as I said in Istanbul, flashlights, but it's that community presence again that feels key.
Absolutely, Andy. It's key. It's, again, a little bit of what I talked about before. The government, state, federal, city, they're going to come in and they're going to help respond. But we actually see so much good that comes out of when the community comes together to help each other, and really helps to get that community moving in the right direction towards recovery. And, where I want to focus is how do we help those communities build those types of plans? How do we help communities and neighborhoods, right down to the neighborhood level, actually work together and know how they're going to support each other? We had a great community when I worked in Aurora, Colorado, called Heritage Eagle Bend, and it was a 55 and older community. They developed their own emergency management team, their own emergency response team. They had the list of the neighbors that were very vulnerable.
Mm.
And when something happened, they would call on them, they would check on them, and they had teams that were designed to go check on neighbors. Such a great example of how neighbors helping neighbors can make such a big difference in the immediate hours after a disaster.
So how do we spread that gospel, or the template or the practice?
I think that's word of mouth. It's forums like this. So thanks for having me on so we can start talking about that. But examples like that are across this country, and really need to work on how do we help these communities understand the importance of just them building their own network of coming together.
Well, I'm really, really thrilled that you could spend some time with us. If you have another couple of minutes, that'd be great. But I know you have a lot to do always. I can't imagine the challenges you face in a multi-hazard landscape like we have, and with these, of course, the long shadow of recovery. You're dealing with every
Yeah.
aspect of it: mitigation, uh, managing the event, the emergency,
Mhm.
and recovery. FEMA has a huge, huge task, and so everyone there deserves a big back pat once in a while.
Well, thank you, Andy. I think that they're doing an amazing job, some of the best in government. And, I liked what you had said in the beginning about the risk reduction piece of this, right? Can we become a risk reduction agency? And what I would say to that is the emergency management cycle has always had that in there, right? It has always been preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. I think that we just get really focused on the response and recovery because it's tangible, right? And it's what's immediate. But the preparedness and the mitigation, while I'm here, we're going to have an increased focus on that. And how do we start to reduce the impacts that we're seeing from climate change? And how do we help prepare citizens across the country to be better able to withstand those?
Well, it's great that you're doing that. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong thing. I anything I can do to amplify that message, and of course this relates to the budgets too. What Congress, the budget for FEMA over at Forest Service, the same thing. The budget for firefighting is in the billions. The budget for mitigation is always being squeezed. So if there's a session to do here that gets at how to create those, to shift that dynamic and the politics, as Jeff and Sam know too well, that it's easier to cut a ribbon or make a speech after a disaster than you don't get reelected on something that doesn't happen.
No, absolutely. And before I sign off here, I think the point that that you make is really in line with the things that we're focused on here is how do we think about the future risks that the country is going to face, and how do we make deliberate investments in both time, planning, and resources in order to mitigate those risks. It's not going to be an easy process, and it's going to take time, but we have to stay committed to it in order to really make a difference in how we're going to be able to keep up with the number of severe weather events that we continue to see.
Yes, and to get communities oriented toward the things they can do and what governments at different levels can do to facilitate community preparedness, resilience, and design. We didn't even talk about community design. That's a whole nother possibility. In fact, I'll just show you one quick thing before you go. Here, this is a slide I made. It's right here in my neighborhood. It's a asphalt or pervious surface. Right there, you have climate risk, climate opportunity.
I love it. That's a great slide.
So, and that can be done not just for heat as well. Portland State University Vivek Chandas, during that awful heat wave, he went around with his infrared camera and showed the difference between the temperatures on a green wall and a conventional asphalt wall. So and this is everywhere. So thank you again, Deanne Criswell, Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for being with us on Shakeout, the great Shakeout Day, and have a good one.
Thanks, Andy. And don't forget to drop, cover, and hold on later today.
Absolutely. And,
right.
And thank you again. It was great that we could fit this in.
Have a great day. Thank you for having me.
Great. And Jeff and well, I'm glad we could work this out. So Jeff Schlegelmelch runs the National Center for Disaster Preparedness here at Columbia University at the Climate School as well. And he's also author of the book, Rethinking Readiness, A Brief Guide to 21st Century Mega Disasters. Cheery topic, but we have to think about these things and do something. And of course, my friend Sam Montano, someday we'll meet in person. Sam, I'm going to be spending more time in Maine, where my wife's mother's from up there. So in your book, Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, is making the rounds right now. So can you reflect a little bit, maybe Sam first, on what we just were talking about? And I might play that's a great public service announcement Sam has done on there's no such thing as a natural disaster, or you could just replicate it. So what's your thinking as we just went through this little chat?
Yeah, I think Administrator Criswell touched on a lot of different important topics in just a few minutes there. I think in terms of preparedness, one thing that I know Jeff and I have both talked about is this need to really kind of expand our understanding of what preparedness is. There are these very kind of acute things that we need to know related to protective actions, like with what we're doing with the National Shakeout Day. But, there's also the gathering of the supplies, the building of community cohesion, the changing of policies to create a more prepared community, right? There's all of these different kind of components of preparedness. So definitely great to focus on the particular protective action needed for a particular hazard today. But good to hear that, all of those other kind of components of preparedness are on the radar and also getting kind of thrown in here as well.
And what's your thinking on, to me, one of the toughest issues is that the one we touched on toward the end about budgets and the way agencies and governments approach these problems, which is all back end. It's, it's management, recovery, and a little bit on mitigation. Is there, and you've dealt with this enough to maybe have a thesis on how we can flip that, or is it just hopeless?
No, well, no, hopefully it's not hopeless. Yeah, so we have always really in emergency management, with rare exception, had a reactive approach to emergency management. We've, focused on response and recovery, but as Criswell said, mitigation and preparedness has always been a part of emergency management. It just hasn't gotten the attention and the funding and the support that it really needs for us to kind of make that shift of being more proactive, kind of as a overall profession. My thesis on how to change this is that it needs to kind of have a kind of groundswell of support among the public. There needs to be pressure from the public. I would call it like a movement for disaster justice. To me, that would really include a focus on taking this more proactive approach. So again, I come from an organizing background, so that's kind of where my mind is at with that. And I do think that as we see more disasters across the country, as our risk is changing, increasing in many cases, you have more people experiencing different disasters, experiencing them more frequently, that the possibility of that kind of groundswell movement is becoming more likely, I think, as we move into the future. Certainly, there are many community organizations across the country that are already doing this work. And I think amplifying them, kind of building more groups and building that network, building a potential movement is kind of something unique, something we haven't necessarily really seen in our history of emergency management, and could be a pathway forward.
Yeah, and Jeff, over to you on this. I keep being struck in reporting on these questions, whether it's the heat wave or the flash floods in New York, how, if you could get to the vulnerability part, in Oregon, it was, of those 700 or so deaths so far counted, a big chunk of them were elderly people in mobile homes without air conditioning, and that, over and over and over. And it was basement apartments that we all know, there's hundreds of thousands of them, mostly illegal in New York City. And there's a community effort to legalize them, regulate them, make sure there's more awareness and evacuation. So that's the same thing over and over again. So where do we go with here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there's a reason why social indicators are increasingly a more reliable predictor of disaster recovery than investments in the built environment and preparedness kits and things like that, which isn't to say those things aren't important. They're absolutely important. Sure. But these social structures are sort of woven into the fabric of all of our different political systems, the built environment, et cetera, et cetera. And so the body of research is increasingly showing how important that is. And that's why I think things like the Great Shakeout and things like that are great, because it's sort of first order preparedness, how to keep yourself alive in the immediacy of the shaking. But we also can't, wash our hands afterwards, go back to work and say we're done, because then the question is, what's next? Who's more vulnerable? Who's going to have a home to go back to? Who's going to have resources they can call on in that recovery process?
Who had insurance or
exactly, yeah. And we've done a good job over the years of actually reducing the number of people killed by disasters. Let me phrase that differently. The people directly killed by disasters, indirect deaths are increasing significantly, and that's where even though we're facing more disasters, we're not seeing as many people drowning from storms or being killed in earthquakes, with some exceptions. But that's only a first order indicator. Then we're looking at this tail of recovery, which can take decades and even generations, and hold some communities back while others move forward. And the social overlay, who has access to government resources and who doesn't, and I want to touch briefly on the mitigation discussion as well too, that there has been a lot more money coming through the BRIC program and opening up some of the hazard mitigation grants, which is great, but there's an administrative barrier. Like, there's a matching requirement which can be waived, but even if that's waived, these are not easy grants to write. These take a lot of technical expertise, a lot of time. And so I know one of FEMA's pillars of their strategic plan is to simplify FEMA. I don't know how much of that is actually doable by FEMA and how much actually has to come in the legislation. So I'm all for legislating more money, but we also need to legislate easier ways to access that money. Otherwise, only those who can afford lawyers and professional grant writers.
Yeah, that I've heard in the wider climate adaptation finance arena. You know, the climate adaptation finance plans you see are all for storm barriers around Wall Street.
Yeah.
And it doesn't do much for exactly the people who are more at risk. This one thing, you know, Andrew Krushevitz at Columbia was on here a couple of times talking about flash floods as being a particular acute and strange factor that hasn't really been adequately seen as its own thing. That New York after Sandy, the whole focus was on coastal flooding, and when in fact this is something that can happen everywhere, anywhere where there's rainfall that's faster than drainage. And I don't know whether it's just something that's new on the landscape or not. But Sam, you know, and clearly we're heading to a world with more heavy deluges, and we also have more pavement than ever. So should this be getting more attention? Maybe as a last focal point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, flash flooding isn't new, but I think what is new for people is the frequency with which it's happening and kind of the severity of it, to your point of climate change plus the landscape that we have, development, the state of infrastructure, et cetera. So I do think it is certainly a hazard that is on people's radar in a more serious way, and definitely one that, you know, needs more attention. You know, when you look at those death totals from various types of hazards, flash flooding is high up on the list along with heat waves. So in terms of just mortality, certainly a focus on flash flooding moving forward is important.
Great. Well, this is a short special episode of my session because I've got other things to do today, but this was a great amplification of the question of a great shakeout. I think the more we can think of it as a great risk shakeout and not just an earthquake shakeout, a drill where we take a day to assess, and it's not just your personal safety. The shakeout is great, but it's mostly about you getting under a desk and holding on. The idea of shaking out the risk in a community more generally, who is vulnerable, what are the inactions like the storm drains, and what are we not understanding about historic hydrology in our neighborhoods? I'm going to do another session on that soon. You know, the underpinning, if you look at where the rivers were in a city, you know where the risk is now. And because those streams will find their way back to where they were, even if there's pavement. And it's great to have had you both here today with Administrator Criswell. So Jeff Schlegelmilch at NCDP, the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, author of Rethinking Readiness, and Sam Montano, disasterologist extraordinaire, easy to find online, and your book, Disasterology. We'll have to do just a deep dive into the book sometime soon. Thank you for being with me today on this episode of Sustain What? And I'll be writing this up on my bulletin blog, revkin.bulletin.com. And anyone can share these as soon as we're done. The links to the videos can be shared, and on we go. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us, Andy.
Thanks, Andy. Always great to be here.